Tonight we'll be talking about CM Kejriwal running his government from behind bars and a Baloch separatist attack against a Pakistan Navy airbase. But first we'll talk about the Moscow terror attack. Now Russia witnessed its most horrific terror attack in 20 years when 4 terrorists gunned down 139 civilians at the Crocus City Hall in Moscow. Indians who saw the horrific visuals coming out of the attack were instantly reminded of the November 26, 2008 attacks on Mumbai. There are several parallels between Mumbai and Moscow. The cold-blooded killing of hundreds of innocent civilians using guns and knives, arson to create a bigger spectacle for the TV cameras. Now, Mumbai 26/11 was the work of the Pakistani deep state. We have overwhelming evidence to suggest this. But who was behind the Moscow 26/11 style attacks? Joining me to discuss this are Grigori Serscikov, Ambassador Anil Trigunyat, and my colleague Justin Thomas in the studio here. Gentlemen, welcome to the News9 Plus show. Grigori, I want to start by asking you, is it absolutely clear in your mind that it was ISIS that carried out this attack? What are the unanswered questions around this horrific terror attack in Moscow?
From what we have been seeing so far, there is no doubt in my mind that this attack was perpetrated by ISIS, precisely ISIS Khorasan, or Vilaya Khorasan, in Moscow, exactly.
Right, and President Putin said today that he believes it was Islamic terrorists who carried out the attack. It's a shift in his earlier statements. Does that indicate that the Russian state also believes that this is the case, and the fact that, it's not that wider conspiracy has kind of abated now, the fact that there could be Western countries or something involved in this? Is that now out of the realm of possibility?
The President Putin said yesterday that the attack was definitively perpetrated by Islamist terrorists, but he also added that, but who was behind this attack, who actually was paying for this attack, it still needs to be cleared,
right?
To be investigated.
Right.
Yes, but so far the main reason, the main idea that the attack was perpetrated by ISIS in Russia, and the main perpetrators were Tajik of Tajik nationality.
Yes, absolutely. Justin, a lot of unanswered questions there. Before I come to you, I'm going to ask Ambassador Trigunyat this. Ambassador Trigunyat, whatever big, spectacular terror attack takes place, it's usually quickly templatized and adopted by other terror groups. We have the example of Mumbai 26/11 being templated and used in others to attack other cities, like you have it being attacked, the Westgate City Mall being attacked in Kenya, and then in Paris. Do you believe that this terror attack, I mean, it's a very strange kind of terror attack, if I may use that word, that you have, unlike religiously brainwashed, jihadi terrorists who come and they fight to the finish. Here you had something that looked something out of, a scenario that's out of this Hollywood film, The Usual Suspects. Where a bunch of people who don't know each other are called by, mysterious people who are promised money, they carry out this attack. Do you think this is a new template of a terror attack that we can worry about?
Well, I think, in my view, we should worry about terrorism per se.
Yes.
And unfortunately, what we see is that there is no serious effort globally to fight this global menace. We have seen, India suffered a great deal, and you mentioned 26/11. But what is interesting about these two, and in Russia, this is not the first time. I used to be there in Moscow when they used the Chechen wars, and at that time, this country, whether attacks on the metros or the theaters were rather common, and with great, very difficult times those were. But now we thought that ISIS is probably consigned to history, but ISIS is seen live and kicking and doing everything. But what is common in both these events and also in Sri Lanka attacks is that there was a prior intelligence and very incredible intelligence from both sides, but because of the trust deficit that was not carried out. Do you remember that 26/11 also we had initially we about this? Here, the Americans have been advising their people to leave. Apparently, they had shared with the Russians that there could be an attack like that.
Right.
But because of the trust deficit,
Yes.
it becomes extremely difficult for the agencies to take to take it to the logical conclusion
Right.
and do that. So that is something. But I must say that now the world has to gear up.
Yes.
They cannot just sit in silos and think that my terrorist versus your terrorist.
Yes,
There
absolutely.
are a number of reasons, groups which are very, very solid, and ISIS knows how to regroup itself. It is a diffused group at the moment, but its ideology is very much alive. Just last week or so, I think the ISIS head of India, that Faruqi, was arrested.
Yes.
We have seen one IIT graduate, IIT student from Assam,
Yeah.
who was also arrested. So it is very much there. I mean, it is. We cannot just, in the other scheme of things,
Right.
forget about terrorism. But that Pakistan still remains a terror factor.
Yes, absolutely. No, and the point that you made, Ambassador Trigoniath, very important one, the trust deficit. And in the world that we are in right now, the trust deficit between Russia and the US is probably at, there's absolutely zero trust between the two sides, and which is why President Putin, I mean, just 3 days before the bombings, Justin, you remember what he said, that he disregarded the warnings and he said it's actually outright blackmail, that the Western world seems to be threatening to intimidate and blackmail our society. But what are the unanswered questions according to you, Justin? You've looked at these terror attacks very closely.
I think one of the things that we have to, which we have to accept, is that ISIS targeting Russia is not out of, an imagination. Because remember, Russia went, supported that military, outreach
in Syria 10 years back.
That's
yes.
right. So that's already there. Then
Yeah.
obviously ISIS have made it very clear from
Right,
starting onwards.
right.
The Christian world,
Yes.
the world from east to west of
Yeah.
the planets of the continent,
Right.
and Russia is very much in that part of things.
Yeah.
So this adds to that fact that Russia is very much in the crosshairs of
Right,
ISIS,
right.
and they have to. So basically, we are seeing a mutation of the kind of terror attacks that we are seeing. So
Yes.
I think the world now has to adapt to a new form where you are where people can just be hired for some money
Right.
and can lead to some terror attacks.
Right.
And this is not a new phenomenon, but it's a worrying phenomenon which Indian security establishment also needs to take into consideration.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the influence of ISIS is still there. They have changed their tactics.
Yes.
They're not maybe like that. They were like 7-8 years back, but they've definitely learned how to go about it. So that's where I think the countries have to learn
Right.
how to target this wave of attacks.
Yeah, so it's actually that DIY terrorists, Justin. This concept came up a couple of years back. If you remember, there's self-radicalized, self-motivated terrorists who usually they were lone wolf attacks, but this one seems to be a larger version of that, the outsourced hit, if you can call it that. But Grigori, what are the other fears apart from this? What Ambassador Trigoniath said, this trust deficit between Russia and the United States, where the US, at least a month in advance, warned the Russian Federation of the possibility of such attacks, and they were disregarded. Could it have other consequences as well? Given the fact that both Russia and the United States are the biggest nuclear weapon states on the planet, the trust deficit, how does this play out in the nuclear weapons scenario when you're disregarding these kind of warnings? I mean, could this spiral into something worse in your mind?
Yeah, potentially everything is possible, but I think that concerning the nuclear issue,
Yeah.
there is preventing mechanisms between Russia and the United States. There is a hotlines not only between militaries and ministers of defense, but for example, a hotline between the head of Russian foreign intelligence, Mr. Narishkin, and his counterpart Burns in the CIA. So, but to prevent nuclear holocaust, I believe there are still solid mechanisms in place, and they are functioning.
They're functioning indeed, but the larger implications of these attacks, Grigori, the fact that like you mentioned, the modus operandi, Justin suggested, the outsourced hit, where you have a group of terrorists with no previous record, who've already inside the Russian Federation, and they're carrying out these kind of you can't call them lone wolf attacks, but lone wolves attack, wolf pack attacks or something like that. But does that present a possibility of more such attacks occurring in the future?
Yeah, so we have to look back into background of these perpetrators, of the terrorists.
Right.
In fact, there is a huge pool of potential recruits in Russia today who came from the Republic of Central Asia.
Yes.
And don't forget the official terrorists, designated terrorists now in custody, they are all Tajik, and Tajikistan is bordering Afghanistan.
Right.
And so I'm confident that they were recruited by fellow Tajiks from Afghanistan who spoke their language and understood their mentality. So yes, potentially there is a huge possibility that the similar copycat attack could take place in Russia.
Right, absolutely. Ambassador Trigoniat, now, while the Russian Federation believes that this is the work of Islamic militants, there's this speculation that who was behind them and, who could have paid for this. Do you think that this could become the casus belli for a larger provocation, an escalation in the war that's already on between Russia and Ukraine? It could be used to stage further, conventional attacks, for instance.
Yeah, Sandeep, I think we have already seen the escalation of attacks, because earlier, as you know, the Russian side was thinking that this has been perhaps perpetrated with the behest of the Western countries as well as the Ukrainian, because their exit route was basically through Ukraine.
Yes.
That is something that has been flagged. But all the facts are not there on the ground at the moment.
Yes.
But I think that Russians will eventually find out which way it was going, apart from the intelligence labs and the security labs that occurred.
Yes.
So now we have to beef it up more internally also, not only externally fighting.
Right.
Because when you're fighting a war, today the war has become very complex. Number one, not only it has become far too long, but at the same time it is in different theaters. And the domestic theater is the worst and the most, I would say, easy to penetrate. I mean, that's what probably happened now.
Right.
So I think this is very important, and Russia has an experience earlier, as I mentioned, during the Chechen wars.
Yes, there's some horrific terrorist attacks then, the Beslan school siege in 2004, Moscow theater attacks. Yes, I mean, of a scale that we've not seen before that.
There have been some attacks happening to this one also, because there was a synagogue attack where there were gunmen, and again there's a pattern that is building up slowly but surely in Russia, which I think Putin should be worried about, because this only shows that there's a web, there's a network being built up, there's a organizational things, because it's not a lone wolf case. This is clearly, it has been planned well. So it is a homegrown situation that they are facing right now, but at the same time there is an influence from outside. So the main point is obviously where is it being perpetrated from?
Where is it being perpetrated from? Ambassador Trigoniat, now in the past you had, like, with the Chechen terrorists, you had a very clear link to Chechnya, but here with ISIS, they recruit from literally all over the entire Islamic world, especially Central Asian republics. So, and of course there are about 1 million Central Asians working in the Russian Federation from all the stans, as they call it. You see that as a problem now? Would there be, greater restrictions?
You see, at one time it was Raqqa and Mosul, where it was easier to fight for the Americans and the West and Russians. Everybody was fighting them. So it was easier to decimate that time. But now they are in a diffused and centripetal form. So it will be far more difficult to catch them, do different parts. So they can now, with the technology which they are adept at hunting, I mean, I must say the ISIS has used the technology to the maximum in their warfare at that time and now also. So they regroup, they radicalize, they outsource. They are also acting perhaps like mercenaries. Because you see, the Central Asian, there are a large number of people who are fighting both for the Russians as well as for the Ukrainians. And Pakistan, because of Afghan war and Afghan destabilization, Tajikistan also has a large number of Islamic militants groups there. So it's far more easier to transport that and just to make money, because whatever one heard, that I will be paid 500,000 rubles and things like that. So that clearly their objective was essentially monetary. So for that they could take and get away with it. But the idea was because Putin has won the election.
Yes.
So it is obvious to show that, you are not in control.
Yes, you're not the strong man that you claim. That's the idea, I guess, Justin, as we were discussing. But Grigori, this new pattern of terrorism, like again, this outsourced hit, mercenaries. I mean, in India, we're very unfamiliar with this kind of thing because in 26/11, those terrorists came to fight to the death. They came to fight to the finish and they were promised, paradise in the afterlife and all. But here it seems that they were, promised rubles. So is this a new threat that Russia must be aware of, that its stance, the workers from the stance who are there, there could be terror cells among them?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point because it's clearly a different pattern. Actually, there is no pattern. It's an outliner concerning the modus operandi of ISIS. Because, as you rightly said, ISIS terrorists usually come to die, not to escape.
Yes.
But here, based on what Russian media is saying, they were promised, they got payment of 500. The numbers are different between 500,000 and 1 million rubles.
Right.
And yes, they try to escape
Yes.
towards Ukraine. And that's quite unusual.
Yes.
If you look at a recent massive terrorist attack by ISIS in Iran, in Qumran,
Yes.
In the beginning of this year, when two terrorists blown themselves among the crowds, commemorating the death of Qasem Soleimani in Qumran.
Yes.
So they died, killing around 100 people. Again,
Right.
it's clear-cut pattern of ISIS modus operandi. But here, it was obviously not. And another interesting point: the entire attack
Yes.
took only 13 minutes.
Right.
So they escaped after 13 minutes. They
Yes.
escaped the Crocus Center. Again, it's quite unusual. Short time, killing as much as possible and
Yes.
escaping.
Yes.
I can't say with certainty that in the future this similar type of attacks will take place,
Right.
but it's indeed an outliner in the modus operandi.
Absolutely. And Ambassador Trigoniat, as they once said of the Bofors gun, is a shoot and scoot capability. So you're looking at shoot and scoot terrorists now, who are doing this for money rather than, the afterlife.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, even in India and Kashmir earlier, we saw that because they could not penetrate into India,
Yeah.
so they tried to recruit people who don't have any record.
Yes.
So the new ones, just first timers.
Right.
So that is also becoming a new trend in this terrorism business.
Yeah.
So I think one has to be extremely careful and
Absolutely. Shoot and scoot
they
terrorists shooting for money, carrying out terror attacks and then fleeing. These are new patterns, very disturbing patterns, emerging from Russia's 26/11, the horrific Moscow attacks. I'd like to thank Ambassador Trigoniat, my friend Grigori and Justin for joining us this evening to talk about this. This is a story that we'll be looking for answers, because these answers will help us understand patterns, the new patterns that terrorists are using across the world. These attacks are usually replicated by terrorists, and one fears that this could be a pattern that terrorist groups would use across the world. Thank you for watching.
Streaming on News9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.